Hey folks, this is Craig. Today we have Taylor Adkins on the show, and he's known for translating some of the works of Felix Guattari. And when I first contacted him, I knew I wanted to talk about just Guattari. And we were going back and forth on a topic, and eventually we landed on a recent seminar that he translated that you can find on his blog, Fractal Ontology. The work that we're looking at today is a translation of a seminar called The Four Unconsciouses. I wanted to release this episode now because it seems that Deleuze and Guattari are a huge interest area for those people listening to the podcast. And the issue of the unconscious in Deleuze and Guattari is of perennial interest. And before I forget, I'm going to put all the information about Taylor's blog and his new book in our show notes. So if you're listening on YouTube, it should be right there. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or something like that, it'll probably be in those notes too. Okay, let's get to the episode. This is Acid Horizon, a theory podcast which confronts global crisis and the specter of a world that could be free. This is episode 7, Guattari Tapes, a discussion with Taylor Adkins about Guattari's Four Unconsciouses. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. Today we have the inimitable Taylor Adkins at our service. He is the host of Theory Talk and translator of many of Felix Guattari's works, notably the essay compilations Chaosophy and The Machinic Unconscious. He also has a recently translated, forthcoming, multi-volume work by Gilbert Simondon called Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. How are you today, Taylor?
I'm good. Thank you for the intro. Yes, that is, forthcoming as in like imminently with two eyes very, very soon. It should be dropping in people's mailboxes. I will say that the Chaosophy volume, I was a small co-translator to that. So I wouldn't want to take full credit for that at all. I got my feet wet in the business, as they say in wrestling. I guess we could say too to the listeners that if we are going to talk about this essay or this little seminar, I posted on my blog, Fractal Ontology, just on a whim, a translation of one of Guattari's seminars. It's called The Four Unconsciouses. That seminar work is just available online and is waiting to be, translated and published in a volume. So there's always new stuff on the Acid Horizon.
Initially, I was going to talk to you about something from Chaosophy that struck my notice recently, but after reading the seminar that you translated and then posted on your blog, it made me think this is a great time to just talk about Deleuze and Guattari's theory of the unconscious. And also here we have Guattari formulating either a typology or a topography of the unconscious. And this was one of the things that really had taken me aback when first encountering their work. In producing this episode, I'm thinking of all the people who are coming to the work of Deleuze and Guattari, seeing the word unconscious, and then realizing it's very different than what Freud, Lacan, and Jung and all those folks are doing. So maybe we can start just by asking, what is their theory of the unconscious in general, and how does it differ from its psychoanalytic counterparts?
Oh man, I mean, this is great. I will try not to approach that notion, I guess, too broad. I'll kind of start with some aspects. I mean, you brought up Freud and Jung and Lacan, of course, and there are many others that will draw upon that lineage when they speak of the unconscious. And in some ways, just due to the training of Deleuze and Guattari, one as a philosopher, one as an analyst, as a psychoanalyst in the Freudian tradition, classically, at least insofar as Guattari was Lacan's student and Lacan was returning to Freud, you could say that, yes, the notion of the unconscious comes from mainly a psychoanalytic register. I mean, of course, you have some theories, especially as recent as the German idealists with like Schelling, who also used this term before Freud kind of crystallizes it in a different discourse. But for the most part, we can say that the Freudian lineage merits attention, merits discussion. And so in that sense, all kinds of things that Freud describes about the unconscious still have a certain merit and a certain logic in the ways that Deleuze and Guattari take it up. It has a lineage. And on the other hand, you see what Guattari is trying to do with, sometimes he emphasizes like a change in register, like why this new term of schizoanalysis, right? Precisely to differentiate it from the traditional notion of suke, of a sort of soul or interiority, in this mental representative way, in this individualistic and ego-centered way too, right? So precisely already to sort of harken back to Deleuze talking about the split ego, the swarming of egos, this multiplicity at the heart, the schizo heart. So in that sense too, I think Guattari is, he's keeping the term, but he's definitely renovating the network of conceptual points and lines of deterritorialization of one hand, but just the lines in which it composes with other concepts in a kind of constellation on whatever map one might diagram. And in that sense, I think Guattari, this is why he'll describe it as a machinic unconscious, kind of classic binary, but at least one to start the discourse about how this unconscious is different, right? They'll describe Freud as a Greek tragedy type of representative staging or a showcasing that the unconscious represents, right? Contents, so to speak. And I think that for Guattari instead, as they say, it's a factory, it machines, it engineers, and it's on these different registers that aren't merely linguistic, right? I think that's the main point that you'll see in the machinic unconscious, but also in the regime of signs, that the unconscious isn't mainly linguistic. And it's to Freud's detriment that the best, or at least when he's at his most creative, he kind of conceives the unconscious, at least the unconscious of dreams, in terms of a rebus, where you have linguistic fragments, but also representative imagistic thing fragments, and they compose together to reveal like a secret message. I think that for Guattari, that's not on the level of engineering the components of expression and the melding the unformed matters and the functions and matters that aren't yet on the strata, they're not stratified. That's why it's different, I suppose. I would start there with that differentiation. It's both, hearkening back to this legacy, but taking it out of its merely sort of representative and linguistic regime.
If you read the seminar that you translated, there's a notion of the subjective unconscious, which seems to incorporate or fold into it the notion of a representative unconscious. And when we think of a representative unconscious, typically, like from a Freudian standpoint, perhaps even a Jungian standpoint, it's all in our heads. And I'm also thinking here about Lacan's statement that the unconscious is structured like a language.
Yes.
It seems that what Guattari does is he's going to take that and then explore its fullest implications. In what way, if the unconscious extends beyond the barrier of skin and skull, how is everything structured semiotically in the social field? And so, I mean, in my pre-episode content, I mentioned that or my assertion was that Deleuze and Guattari present a fully materialist notion of the unconscious, insofar as these unconscious contents, repressed contents, aren't just in the brain. They're happening in the social field too. And so maybe this is a good moment to go into the distinction between these four different unconsciouses: the subjective unconscious, the material unconscious, the territorial unconscious, and the machinic unconscious. So maybe just first, we'll just talk about what is the subjective unconscious.
I'll try to link things up to these other texts, because what I see in the seminar is I see Guattari, as I told you sort of in our messages together, Guattari never takes up these four dimensions, which he says will be, these four unconsciouses are actually dimensions of the same assemblage, of the machinic assemblage as a whole. And I think that he's always reworking his terms. I feel like the seminar is partly a kind of a trial ballooning of discourse.
Yeah.
So, and I said to you that these four unconsciouses seem to, on the one hand, they meld into the three ecologies later in his writing. But on the other hand, you can look at A Thousand Plateaus and you can look at the machinic unconscious, those two works, and you can see these four aspects getting linked to another one of your questions that I know we'll talk about later. Not just the notion of the diagrammatic. You'll see this in the fifth plateau on several regimes of signs. You'll see a diagram on page 146. And it's the four levels of schizoanalysis or pragmatics, because a lot of times so much of the Machinic Unconscious, the book itself, is trying to renovate a notion of pragmatics and linguistics, and to even argue that linguistics would be a subfield of a larger pragmatics understood in this generalized way rather than the reverse. In this diagram, we see there's four different, he calls them components, right? It's four different sort of dimensions of what pragmatics, what schizoanalysis would do. And you have the generative component, which is about studying mixed semiotics, right? It's how they vary from one another. So we're still within kind of a regime of language to a certain extent. The second is this transformational level, which is about transformations and translations from one semiotic into another. Then you have this third, which is the diagrammatic. It's the study of abstract machines, right? So it's about this more abstract level of semiotically unformed matters and semiotically unformed matters, and physically unformed matters. I guess that should be semiotically unformed functions. It looks like I'd have to look at the French, but anyway. And then the Machinic component, which also the fourth component, which aligns with the fourth dimension of the assemblage, with the fourth unconscious, with the Machinic unconscious, that studies how assemblages effectuate abstract machines, right? How they semiotize matters of expression and physicalize matters of content. So those four levels, I think you can see transposed in this seminar about the four different unconsciouses, right? The subjective, the material, the territorial, and the Machinic. And so, yes, on the subjective level, as you brought up earlier, we're still kind of in this, I don't want to call it the lowest, because I think Guattari is talking about everything happening at the same time and coinciding and having the potential to open up and on these lines of flight and become. But insofar as it closes in on itself, yes, it would be the lowest for Guattari. And that would be the very first level of a two-tiered level of what he calls semiology, which would merely be sort of on the lowest level of the redundancies of signifiers. I think that for Guattari, that's also the lowest on an analytic level, because it turns into this is where we could also talk about black holes, where the signifiers sort of swirl around this black hole and this endless sort of redundancy of anchoring around a supposed hidden like linguistic content to an unconscious that would reveal itself through transference to an analyst who could say, oh, well, here's how you connect up your associations and voila, now enjoy your neurotic symptom.
I had an insight reading this. I was basically reading this seminar alongside Anti-Oedipus. And
great. Yeah.
It seems that the perennial problem for psychoanalysis, at least as I see it, has been to square the circle of how do you get from any unconscious repression to a sort of social repression, right? And this is what Anti-Oedipus is about. And given the fact that Anti-Oedipus antedates this seminar, it made me think, okay, how is Guattari doing this so that it squares with the project of Anti-Oedipus, which I feel as an improvement upon anything that Freudo-Marxists tried to do in terms of squaring psychic repression with social repression. And so in the subjective unconscious section here, the one thing that really stands out to me is the focus on neurosis.
Yes,
and that the dimension of the subjective unconscious is this kind of tethering to neurosis and even an obsessional neuroticism. And already in this section, they're talking about, this is another Guattari term that I think we need to unpack a little bit, the component of expression. And I have marked in my notes that the assemblage can be modified at the level of component of expression. One of the things that I thought about was Kafka. And in my pre-episode content, I talked about Kafka and the way that he used the German language in a way that was very unique. It was very un-German in some sense, that he was able to take the components of expression, which in this case were the German language, and configure it in such a way as to reveal lines of escape or lines of flight out of repressive apparatuses that connect to the dominant form of the German language. Does that make sense?
Oh, of course. I mean, that's right up your alley. I mean, that he's a constant reference for them. And I think that's why the minor literature volume that you brought up in our pregame is, obviously important. And I like that Guattari, even in that little section that we're looking at, the subjective unconscious section, he brings up Kafka and these techniques, these techniques of novelization that I think of them. Have you guys read Bakhtin? If you haven't, it doesn't matter. Bakhtin, he conjures up this notion of the chronotope, this place-time conjunction that is useful for understanding the evolution of the novel. So how the narrative is able to like coalesce these chronotopes. And so with Kafka with him talking about Kafka doing the semiotic magnification or distancing, acceleration or deceleration, there's a certain manipulation of maybe a non-Euclidean one of chronotopes. And I think that accords well with what you're talking about of this minorization of the German language, that it goes part and parcel with that linguistic experimentation. You have this novelistic experimentation and new, and I think that's what's important about these components of expression, is that I think for Guattari, that's and expression has to be taken in the broadest sense, right? Outside of any purely linguistic sense, any sense of just meaning, because precisely you can even think about Deleuze's work on Spinoza and the philosophy of expression, right? This, if you take it in that broadest sense, I think that that's where we have to go with component of expression and how it becomes a focal point for even his like study of Proust. Because a lot of times he'll talk about Proust and Kafka in the same breath, or both of them will, really.
The interesting thing to me here is the whole notion of a practical way to engage with the unconscious. And there's an essay. You know what? Now that I have you on the line, I'm going to ask you the favor of finally translate. Evidently, there's some essay that Deleuze wrote in 1961 on, I think it was on Sade or Sacher-Masoch, but he also talks about Carl Jung in there. And evidently, Deleuze disavowed this essay at one point. Do you know the essay that I'm talking about?
I do. I'd have to get a copy of it in French. I know that there's I forget the guy's name. I'll think of it later.
Christian Kerslake? Yeah.
I still have it. I have his volume on Deleuze where he talks about Jung and Deleuze, and he does talk about that essay. And I didn't know it wasn't translated.
I can't find it. But anyway, the point being is that when it comes to Carl Jung, I see that some of the practical methods that Guattari is employing in schizoanalysis, they tend to mirror things that are done in the Jungian tradition of psychoanalysis. When I had Cadillac Healthcare here in the United States, I underwent Jungian analysis for a while, and they do all sorts of things like amplification and of dream images and things that you kind of imagine on the spot in the therapeutic context.
Right.
And what I see here is kind of an import of those methods. And even just the notion of accelerating or decelerating images and narratives and what have you really attends to that form of practice. And I know that in other texts, Guattari talks about the indispensability of something like free association in a therapeutic context. And it's interesting to see those things appear in what will ultimately become kind of a political program. And that at the level of subjective unconscious, it's not that these tools are completely dispensed with, but what Guattari seems that he's going to disavow is we're not going to reduce any of these occurrences within the subjective unconscious to myth or a return to the Greek tradition, let's say. We can interpret this phenomenon of the unconscious through all kinds of things, like through Kafka's text, for example, or through maybe even a laundry list. I don't know, right? But he's definitely opening up the gamut of what that kind of interpretation looks like.
Yeah, and I would say too that, you know, it's not necessarily that we forego the introduction or study of these ancient models, but that's precisely what they are. They are types of models, and they're also types of, I mean, as Laura Well would say about, like, you know, ancient philosophy or history of philosophy or standard philosophy, quote unquote, it would all, you know, to a certain extent presuppose a kind of Euclidean geometry, a kind of Euclidean topographical space, and so it would succumb to a certain postulate of sufficiency. And I think that's part of, I mean, Guattari taps into this kind of, without theorizing it and axiomatizing it the way Laura Well does, he just kind of spontaneously does it because he's this jack of all trades, because he's drawing on all of these different discourses, and because he's not held in check by any particular school. He is, you know, that kind of nomadic thinker, and It's not a matter of foregoing Freudian analysis of the unconscious, a la the screen memory and all of this other representative ways, but it's just knowing that it's a model, knowing that it's only on the generative level. That's merely a kind of that's a toolbox for the subjective unconscious, right? That lower level, and if one stays within that toolbox itself and presupposes the sufficiency and legitimacy and authenticity and authority of that toolbox alone to the exclusion of the others, then that's when we start to get into merely the talking cure. Then that's when we're merely working with redundancies of resonance that can never lead to true becomings, that are always sort of linguistic language games. And I think that for Guattari, language isn't enough. Language is, insofar as we presuppose language as sort of having this universal basis and having the function of universals, we presuppose its legitimacy for the real, as Laurel might say. We have to know that the machinic side, the side where real effects happened, is much, much broader. And language presupposes the work of those abstract machines rather than the other way around.
That's something I wanted to ask about, actually, because I suspect that if there's any texts with Guattari's name on it, which people listening to are familiar with, it's probably either Anti-Oedipus or A Thousand Plateaus, right? And in the first chapter of A Thousand Plateaus, they claim that they only recognize two kinds of assemblages. There's machinic assemblages of desire and collective assemblages of enunciation.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so that's at the start of A Thousand Plateaus. And so I'm thinking that many people might just sort of know, if anything, those two books. And so I was wondering if you could explain how those two concepts, machinic assemblages of desire and collective assemblages of enunciation, what do those mean, and how do, and with this essay in particular, what does it mean for his seminar, I guess? How does it relate to that?
Those two terms will coalesce with a lot of other terms throughout, and I'll try to cut through the middle, which is what Deleuze and Guattari would want. It's mainly this notion that on the one side, collective assemblages of enunciation, we're dealing with matters of expression or components of expression, be they unformed or whatnot. And then on the other side, the machinic assemblage, that's the matters of content.
That's like a corporeal sort of dimension to it, right? So bodies and objects.
And they always interlock, right? I mean, at least insofar as we have stratification, and we do, and insofar as we have a certain type of existential consistency, we're going to have those two, and they're always going to presuppose each other reciprocally.
Right.
And yet at a certain level, we can, as Deleuze would say in his sort of Cartesian Spinozist language, we can understand and appreciate their real distinction. And yet, especially with Guattari, and this is part of Guattari's indebtedness to Hjelmslev, although he extracts and subtracts from Hjelmslev his reliance on the signifier signified, which ultimately renders him back into the sort of presupposition of language's authority and universality. But Hjelmslev's the one that sort of understands content and expression reciprocally presupposing one another and being two functives of the same functor, as they'll say, or the same function, right? They're interlocking. Depending on the level of analysis, we can provisionally focus on the side of the collective assemblages of enunciation or the side of the machinic assemblage. This also is important for understanding the role of faciality and refrains insofar as they crystallize aspects of the abstract machine, which is why sometimes Guattari will call them concrete machines. But I guess that kind of pushes us to a different topic. Hopefully some of what I said was relevant to your question.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that, possibly people might know A Thousand Plateaus or Anti-Oedipus, and they know these sorts of assemblages. And so I guess just to try and make more concrete that connection, this specific seminar which you just translated, these four sort of levels, I suppose, of the unconscious, is that directly related to these two forms of assemblages?
Yeah, and I would say it's the four unconsciouses are, as they'll say, they're four dimensions of the assemblage,
right?
And so to a certain extent, depending on how we focus on the real distinction or not between content and expression, when Guattari uses that term, that shorthand of the assemblage, he is thinking at one and the same time of of collective assemblages of enunciation and machinic assemblages. And it's kind of like the way they think of desiring machines as the same as social technical machines, yet under a different regime, right? So,
Right. Okay.
So it's kind of like two regimes of the assemblage of assemblages, and it's the same as Guattari's kind of science particles conjunction, or Deleuze's virtual actual. There's actualized flows, and then there's sort of abstract codes. There's these two levels are always intermingling and always in communication, but due to a certain stratification, there's a certain manner in which they become locked. And in fact, I mean, again, this brings one of Craig's questions, and one of the things that he's already talked about in the pregame or the pre-episode was about black holes, and to a certain extent, Guattari and Deleuze too. And this is 1,000 Plateaus and the third plateau on the genealogy of morals, where they talk about the strata literally as black holes, right? Which is not a void in the traditional sense and in the Aristotelian sense, but instead a hyper accumulation, a hyper concentration of energy, implying certain effects, gravitational, etc.
I know one of the ways that Janosko looks at it is that we can construe black holes as a kind of trap for forms of subjectivity, but the notion of trap doesn't entirely capture, I mean, at least in the pejorative sense, because there can be liberating forms of black holes as well.
Since it's a hyper concentration of energy, yes. For example, in the different regimes of signs, you see that one of the levels, the post-signifying, the passional, the level of a certain conscientialization, that has a certain type of black hole. On the signifying side, on that second level, or just on the level of the signifying, you have sort of semiological black holes, which is where I brought up this notion of, signifiers and signifies kind of swirling around in a certain type of redundancy and a type of redundancy of resonance around a certain black hole that could be stultifying. I think that for Guattari, the problem with it's not that black holes are bad and should just be eradicated, that we should know our black holes, which is why we should know our faces, as they say. We should know how they, and this is the role of schizoanalysis. One of the jobs of schizoanalysis or pragmatics is to understand black holes, understand how they both harbor these anchoring potentialities to kind of close in on themselves or close certain regimes of science in on themselves, but they also have sort of the liberating force, as you said, this way in which, one can imagine a line of flight swirling around a planetary system, but given the certain Kleinemann, given that certain angle, could use that gravitational force that was anchoring it in to shoot it off into this hyper intensified becoming. That's why Deleuze and Guattari are always giving warnings, giving cautions. Yes, deterritorialized, but it can become a line of death. It can become a line of abolition. It can be harboring these microfascist components, and can then cause all of the micro black holes to communicate one another and resonate in this macro super black hole. We have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of the potentiality, but also the danger in destratifying and forming the body without organs, et cetera, which is, why they can say at one and the same breath that it's a matter of sobriety, a drop of water, a touch of herb. And yet, on the other hand, that there is a pharmacological reality of brain chemistry that needs to be put into a specific relationship with psychoanalysis, with schizoanalysis. Guattari talks about this in his Gangs of New York essay, where he's like, hey, why is the model taking heroin addicts off of heroin and putting them on methadone, but now you're just replacing one drug with another that's even more addictive, and you're just replacing one crutch. You're just getting rid of the high, but you're keeping the addiction. You need a different model needs to be led, where methadone is used progressively less and less, so that you wean one off of both substances at the same time. You use it as a way to get rid of the addiction, and not to merely sort of turn them into new clients for a pharmaceutical company. That's capitalist mode. Is, oh, now we've got a new client where we can sell them methadone, we can sell them heroin without the high. And it's like, no, that's fucking stupid. That's where the black hole of Freudianism comes up, and where Freud at the end of his life in Analysis Terminable, Interminable is like, fuck, does analysis end? Is there a termination? Is there a terminal point? And for Guattari, yes, it has to. You can't just you can't just turn analysis into this means of filling your client book, this insidious relationship of money and analysis, this love of money that becomes one of the roots of why analysis can't ever end. Is now you've got your patrons, and you literally patronize them with when you're seated behind a couch, and yada yada. And Guattari's like, this has to have real effects that can't just come through talking. We have to conjugate all these different, which comes to putting in variation the daily activities of the analysand. Someone who's cooped up in a cubicle and doing word processing needs to get out and take a stroll, go on a bike ride. On the other hand, someone who's developed pathological symptoms, who's always worked in the fields, might need to be put in conjunction with a writing machine, right? So Guattari was always kind of this mad scientist trying to conjugate these variables and these different activities, and it had to do with what anchors the sort of everyday existence of this individual in their different black holes on these different dimensions, and how do we kind of allow these spaces of freedom, these optional choices, these optional matters to de-stratify and de-stratify in a way that can be done with someone's help, with someone's aid. And in that sense, that's the analyst, and I think that's part of the militancy too, the revolutionary aspect, where you can't just be, not everyone can just be Oedipalized and neuroticized, etc. Even if that were true, it still harbors all of these authoritarian and oppressive regimes that if we're serious and have sort of, we want to promote the general welfare. There's something about schizoanalysis and promoting a higher calling for analysis to promote a better commonwealth, a better general welfare than a bunch of neurotics or a bunch of, medicalized schizos, if you will.
I actually had two questions there, actually. One was about Lacan, because I think it would probably be fair to say that Guattari and Deleuze had a complicated relationship with Lacanian psychoanalysis. My understanding is it wasn't simply, totally condemnatory per se. They think he made some strides in some ways, and so on. But you were talking about the sort of the financial transaction which takes place during the analysis. And although they do at a number of points in Anti-Oedipus praise some of the sort of progress that Lacan had made past Freud, one of the things I remember reading that Lacan and his sort of disciples were criticized for was the extremely short length of the actual sessions, right? Do you think, in a way, that was even worse, in the sense that if there's a problem with the financial aspect of it already, compressing it down even further, is that something that Guattari and Deleuze maybe are concerned about with Lacan?
That's an interesting question. That would be something that I personally don't know. I feel like I would know who to ask about that. DC, he's practicing, he's training to become an analyst. But I will say, again, I think that for Guattari, yes, analysis needs a termination point. On the other hand, the question about schizoanalysis, and it's always about being right on the limit, right? Right on sort of taking analysis to what it can do. And I'm sure that Guattari would have seen the merit in a certain shortened version. But I think that at the same time, he would understand that first comes the tracing, right, of the black holes and the generative components. And then comes the transformational aspect. And now we're making maps of the unconscious. And then we're making diagrams, and we're sort of getting down to the unformed matters, et cetera. And then can we engineer something? So I think that for Guattari, if you put an arbitrary end date, whether it be too long in a kind of cynical way or too short where we just throw them back out, I guess, to the wolves, and again, enjoy your symptom. Thanks for playing. I think that both would be bad. And again, this goes back to the warnings they say, like not to de-stratify too quickly, and also perhaps not to analyze too quickly, too cursorily. Like it really would be a case by case, one time each time type of deal, and not a cookie cutter type of length.
I actually had I just one other question there actually, because at the end there you were talking about sort of the drug-related treatments that are now increasingly prevalent, I guess, in sort of the Anglo-American world, at least. And I wanted to ask, so Deleuze and Guattari are, really concerned about the role of psychoanalysis in its repressive form, and also its sort of participation in, frankly, capitalist repression in general. And so I was wondering today, where in the much of the West, I would say, psychoanalysis has been replaced by a more kind of institutional psychiatry. What would Guattari or Deleuze have to say about that? Is it an improvement, or is it dangerous, or how does it relate now?
I think that Deleuze and definitely Guattari would say, there's something to be merited. There's something good about psychiatry insofar as one trains both medically and in the field, right? So you have that, and Freud had some of that. I mean, not as much as perhaps a current day psychiatrist would, but he had some of that inclination of, he had a biologist's curiosity. He had especially in his early days. I mean, but we can leave Freud aside for the moment. On the other hand, I think that it would be a question of both the sufficiency of medical and psychiatric practice and their ways of effectuating the type of analysis that Guattari would have said, is schizoanalytic, and so that pragmatic side, and then on the other side, the way in which psychiatry would always already, especially in the States, be, as you said, kind of in conjunction with the capitalist flows of the big pharmaceutical companies and their ways of repressing, for example, certain more holistic methods of traditional medicine, like, fucking why is marijuana a Schedule I drug, right? So, and we're starting to loosen that on a state level in certain areas, but obviously in a federal level, it's still put in this category where even conducting the most rudimentary experiments with it to test its efficacy is there's a stranglehold on it, and that is for obviously the benefit of big pharmaceutical companies. I mean, the whole history of marijuana's illegalization in America is not just tied up with pharmaceutical companies, although it is to a certain extent, but it's also in league with chemical companies that saw hemp as a threat to nylon and these other things, right? But the main point being, not, and for reasons unknown to me, not just the pharmaceutical companies are against the federal legalization and descheduling of marijuana. You also have beer companies who wrongly think that it'll cut into their profit shares. And I do say wrongly. I do. People who smoke weed aren't going to be like, oh, well, now that weed's legal, I'm not going to have my Budweiser. I fucking smoke and drink. I mean, they're different. They're different states of intoxication, highly different. And when you mix them together in the right proportions, they can be very good as well. So again, as I say, it's very wrongly, it would be like Marlboro being against marijuana legalization because people would smoke less cigarettes. No, they already have patents for Marlboro Greens, which will be fucking rolled joints in they've had that for years. They've had that patent. They've had that, or trademark, or whatever the fuck what that goes into it. I believe it involves a patent, but they've had that for years and years. It's
Taylor, I just wanted to say you are now credited with dropping the first F-bomb on our show.
Yeah.
So congratulations.
There we go.
It took us that long.
Open the champagne bottles.
I'm so surprised it took us that long. I apologize.
Yeah, I'm disappointed in ourselves, really.
Yeah. So maybe I got on my soapbox there a little bit, guys.
A little bit.
Nothing wrong with that.
We're fine. We're
controversial,
totally fine.
very
That's why we have you here.
takes on marijuana legalization.
Before we move on, because I'm pretty sure Craig was just raring to come back in there with another question, I wanted to ask one last one because so I can only speak from my own experience here in Britain at least, but people here broadly, you bring up Freud, psychoanalysis, it's nonsense, right? It's pseudoscientific, it's unfalsifiable, and so on, so on, so on, right? So for Deleuze and Guattari, who wrote, Anti-Oedipus, and their concern about the sort of Oedipalization of society, I guess, do you think that still has a relevance in the sense that is it still sort of going on behind our backs even if we don't realize it? Is that sort of the idea there?
Well, I think that, yeah, for Deleuze and Guattari, I mean, they would say Oedipalization's, at least in capital, when we sort of, it's always already been there, right? The seeds of capitalism, the seeds of the state, the Erstat, whatever, and the seeds of Oedipus have always already kind of been swirling around, but they've been warded off, right, by these different territorial machines. And it's with, with the full body of capital that we can really say, here's the birth of Oedipus. And they link it to colonialization, right? And you can look at like Foucault, like, let's extirpate the fascists in our own selves. Let's extirpate the colonized in our own selves, both at the same time. So I think that, yes, there's a certain way that even if one discredits Freud or his discourse, you can't thereby say, oh, we've defeated Oedipus, right? You have to go through the sort of theorizer and Freud did. I mean, when he discovers Oedipus, especially in himself and in the self-analyses and the Irma's injection and stuff like that, it's to a certain extent he discovers and invents it at the same time. It had always been there, but I think that's the merit and the downfall of Freudian analysis in the later texts, right? The older Freud, he's wanting a kind of catch-all universal way of diagnosing all pathologies, right? Who wouldn't want the fucking, it's kind of like the one law in physics to explain them all, right?
The final answer to it all.
That's right. So even if one discredits Freud and laughs at him, and there's obviously there's parts of Freudianism that should be laughed at, that doesn't mean at the same time one shouldn't take it seriously, deadly seriously. And I think that's what Deleuze and Guattari do with anti-Oedipus.
Yeah, and so it's almost more dangerous because, if ultimately they're right that this is going on, but we reach a stage where it's not even, taken seriously on a conscious level, it's almost more dangerous if it's constantly going on behind our backs without even being recognized, right?
Yeah, and I think that's part of their project is to revive and show sort of where Oedipus is operating, right? I mean, throughout anti-Oedipus, particularly now, moving to anthropology, cultural anthro, they see an attempt to kind of find Oedipus there, to Oedipalize these individuals. This podcast came about because the three of us did a reading of Calastres, and
Society
that
Against
was
the State.
Yeah, and the way Deleuze and Guattari deal with that text and attempt to show not sort of an anti-state presence there, but an almost non-Oedipalizable one. And their attempts, or at least anthropologists' attempts to desperately seek out some sort of Oedipal structure. So I think you're right when you say that if we simply just say, well, it's about wanting to kill your father and fuck your mother, and isn't that absurd? And leaving it there, then we kind of let it continue to fester in all of these disciplines. And most importantly, deeply, deeply, deeply within clinical psychology.
I agree. And I think that Deleuze and Guattari would say, look, it's not just about whether or not we deal with this discourse of Oedipus. The end goal is to understand, theorize this question that Reich so, brilliantly poses, or the statement really, that it's not about ideology. And I know Matthew will talk about this later, but it's about desire, right? That the masses desired fascism, right? So it's really the end goal, schizoanalysis, right? We can tinker on the level of Oedipus and say mommy, daddy, etc. But at a certain point, Guattari's just going to read a newspaper if you keep saying mommy, daddy, right? We got to get past this point, and we have to address sort of the fascism and micro-fascisms that are part and parcel of desire as being part of the infrastructure. Just to throw a bunch of terms out there. The whole point being that, even if you say, oh, Oedipus doesn't exist, that's a myth. Fascism in all its different forms and all its different instantiations and all its different historical effectuations and its latent virtual potentiality, it's still there. We still have to fucking deal with it. I mean, it's kind of like Derrida when he was asked by an interlocutor after one of his papers he gave at a conference. The guy's like, why do you keep saying God? And Derrida's like, "This fucking word, still have it, it's still there, it still functions. It's not just it functions not just as a signifier, but as this transcendental signified, which phallogocentrism, blah blah blah. You guys get it. It's so yeah. Oedipus kind
No,
of.
it's good to go
Yeah.
through this stuff, though.
Yeah,
I
right.
mean,
Why don't we bring it back to one of the terms that I want to unpack? I just remember the first time picking up 1,000 Plateaus and seeing this word diagram. And he uses this word diagrammatic. And it kind of took me a while in the early days of Deleuze and Guattari to distinguish between the different uses of these terms across the literature, because as you know, sometimes the terms change meanings, and like you say, they're trial ballooning terms, and then later on they're like, maybe it works this way too. I'm thinking of the word abstract machine as being one of those terms. What does that term mean? Because earlier when we were talking about praxis at the level of the subjective unconscious, you mentioned the word diagram. I mean, clearly it doesn't mean drawing a diagram. What's that all about?
So they do define diagram or diagrammatic in various ways. I think the most succinct one, although we'd have to unpack it, is, on the diagrammatic level of schizoanalysis, on this third level, in between the generative, transformational, and the machinic, on the fourth level, they say it consists in taking regimes of signs or forms of expression and extracting from them particle signs that are no longer formalized, but instead constitute unformed traits capable of combining with one another. So I'll try to unpack that as succinctly as I can, that the diagrammatic level, or this emphasis on the diagrammatic level, on this unstratified level, right, on the plane of eminence, or whatever word you want to use, the diagrammatic level is an adjective to a certain extent to talk about this level at which abstract machines are effectuating their work, right? When an abstract machine is functioning directly in a matter, when we can provisionally see kind of like we see waves and particles, waves and photons. We have this complementarity of signs and particles. And this is the level of the abstract machine. This is the level of the diagrammatic. And so this is really one of the most abstract levels, but it's a level that's already in communication and resonating with the machinic level, wherein there's a program at work, and wherein abstract machines actually are effectuated and transform. And so what Guattari will say, as opposed to a simple semiology, which is really always already on this linguistic level of signifiers, signifieds, etc. We're on a different level. We're on this level, this trans-semiotic level, as he'll say. There is no general semiology, but rather a trans-semiotic. And this is why I think that, to get back to Matthew's question about Guattari and his lineage, as him being of the Lacanian lineage, he says on the very first page of the Machinic Unconscious, like, we had the Freudian folklore and the Jungian kind of mythological tropes, but then Lacan came along and said, the unconscious is structured like a language. Obviously not any sort of everyday language, but a mathematical language. And Guattari's like, look, I know, these Lacanians and these other, the Kleinians, et cetera, who came after have tried to like aseptically kind of whitewash the unconscious and sort of formalize it and axiomatize it in this way. But they're even more unbearable than the Freudians and the Reichians and the Jungians, who have these other types of more representative models. And so I think that's what Guattari is trying to say with the transsemiotic. It's not just about the unconscious as a language, even at this most idealized level of a mathematical language, that there are all these machines, these abstract machines that populate and engineer desire and deterritorializations, these lines of flight that conjugate and that are always already informing the level of the strata, which is why the molecular and the molar distinction a lot of times get kind of reduced to a binary, when it's at least a trinity of the molar, the molecular, and the abstract. It's on the level of the abstract that we can see the molecular informing the molar, because the molecular is only the molar from a certain regime, from a certain perspective, right? I mean, it's from the perspective of the great constant Avogadro's number, right? So if we look at it from that number, it's a very efficient way of scientifically calculating atomic weights, and thereby inductively sort of producing the beauty of Mendeleev's little periodic table. But that's only on the level of induction. On the level of transduction, wherein information is not lost, wherein operations and structures are communicating and transforming into one another, which is the level that Simondon brings up, that's when we get to this transsemiotic level. So here, I think really Simondon, if we, maybe in another episode, we can try to come back to some of this, but I think that Simondon would have a lot to say about this level of the diagrammatic. I think he would call it the analogical. He calls it the alagmatic, and he gets the word alagma. It means exchange. So it's at the level of the exchange between structures and operations, or of operations transforming into other operations, structures transforming into other structures, or structures turning into operations, or vice versa. We see he'll create these beautiful little conceptual nodes of crystallization or demodulation, right?
Can you focus in just a little bit on structures transforming into operations? Because this is something that we kind of start to see a little bit in Anti-Oedipus, and maybe this is one area where like listeners will catch on a little bit more. So this transformation into some sort of operationalized entity. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that for Guattari, the prime example is, well, he has two prime examples. One is a little bit simpler than the other. One is on the very one where we can first really understand the operation of individuation on the physical level, on the purely physical level, and that's the crystal, right? So a structure transforming into an operation, or feeding an operation, or propelling an operation, would be when the singularity of a crystalline germ is in the presence and in communication with this pre-individual milieu of intensities and charges, and is able to sort of effectuate what would be known as like a super saturated dimension of a solution, wherein something falls out, right? And so the crystal has a germ, this heart of it, the singularity. It can be a speck of some chemical substrate or whatever, and around it grows this resonating crystalline chamber. I mean, it literally grows. It doesn't have a biological nature. It has a biological analogy, but so that's the role of singularities, and Deleuze will have a very beautiful little footnote on Simondon in the Logic of Sense, where he kind of takes up some of Simondon's terms. The other case would be we find this in A Thousand Plateaus, the formation of the brick, of the parallelepiped, as Simondon says, which is a mouthful, say that 5 times fast. But the brick, as Simondon says, you don't just take any mold and take any clay whatsoever and just plop it down and boom, you've got a brick. The clay has to be prepared. It has to be found. It has to be dug out. It has to be sifted. It has to be kneaded. It has to be, there's this whole technical operation on even the crude material that first has to prepare its the chains of its molecules to apprehend the information coming from the mold, which based on its own matter. He says, for example, if you take a brick and if you're trying to make a brick in a wooden mold, the walls displace a little before settling back, and then progressively harder materials will displace even more or even less, right? If you go to iron and steel, it basically doesn't depress at all, but it does, very minutely, very infinitesimally. But this is the role of information. You have to have potentials in the clay to receive the resonance of the information from the mold pressing in. You have to have a sort of technical operativity going on. And so if we want to see structures transforming into operations and in this kind of communication, we can see that in the brick, right? That as I said, the clay has to be prepared in such a way to become this hexaity of the brick, which is different from every other brick only insofar as it contains this singular history.
Are you talking about perhaps what we would call contingencies?
What Guattari would call those contingencies, he would call them asperities. That one of the contingent aspects of that which makes this singular individual into a hexaity, the here now of this informed individual that is now separate from the individuating pre-individual milieu with which it was in contact, with which it was not distinguished beforehand, which always involves a communication of a charge of energy, right? Of a kind of potential. Metastable situations too. Obviously, it would require metastable circumstances, which is Simondon's whole book. It doesn't make sense without the knowledge of metastability.
Now, the model of the structures turning into operations that you just outlined here with the example of the brick, it makes me think, can this model be applied more broadly, particularly to structures and operations of a greater magnitude? And I'm wondering if this applies to what Guattari points out about Christianity containing the kernel of capitalism.
Yeah, right.
And I'm wondering if we can draw an analogy between brick making and the way that, for example, the institution of Christianity brings about the possibility of capitalism. The axiomatic of capitalism couldn't have even been born until a certain kind of structure was put into place.
Yeah, I think that Guattari uses language that is very similar to Simondon's when he says that Christianity carried the seeds of capitalism in it. It didn't effectuate those. It carried like potential conditions of possibility. What, to speak in a Kantian term or something, or the real conditions of possibility or the conditions of reality, as Laruelle might say, and then all of that is reduces to a certain extent. For Simondon, we have to always understand that the individual carries the pre-individual within it, kind of bears it. It's a charge. It's always especially living beings. This is one of the interesting ways that he'll move from the physical to the biological, where the living being is sort of in constant contact with this pre-individual milieu. And in 1,000 Plateaus, part of this gets discussed with the notion of an annexed milieu, which is like an energy source that living beings have to tap into, obviously, to not only to survive, but to thrive. So to understand individuals, we have to understand the annexed milieus with which they are in communication and contact, from which they draw continual pre-individual charges that further individuation. And I think that the process of that movement is what Simondon understands by information, because he will distinguish his understanding of information, which you can kind of hyphenate in your head. It's literally an in forming, that he'll distinguish that notion from both, information theory in the sense of Shannon's, but also Wiener's cybernetic notion of information. That for Simondon, those are just two of the abstract aspects of considering as one of the lights of individuation. So we have to have a new theory of information, and Simondon tries to provide that. And I think that that's part of where allegmatics comes in. Allegmatics merely focuses on the operative side, the exchange side, so to speak. But it's kind of, again, complementary. In the same way that waves and photons are.
Maybe the last thing that I'll ask you about in the discussion of the unconscious, and then, of course, I want to ask you some things about translation work as well, is the concept of faciality as it relates to the topology of the unconscious that Guattari lays out here. We have the term black holes, and then we have this other term, faciality, and then we have refrains and so forth. And it seems that there's a kind of line, and we have black holes on one side, we have faciality on the other. And on the black hole side, we have the notion of subjectification. And then on the faciality and refrain side, we have the notion of significance. Could you talk about how those concepts relate to Guattari's notion of the unconscious?
They describe faciality as this conjunction of a white wall, black hole.
The conversation continues for our patrons on our Patreon page. Not only do we talk about the concept of faciality, but we really get into an interesting topic when we talk about becoming a translator of philosophy and Taylor's path to becoming a translator of Guattari's works. Taylor shares with us the fact that he learned French specifically to translate Guattari's works. I think this is one of the most interesting parts of our interview with him. If you want to gain access to it, just hop on over to Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, we're pumping out a lot of content this month, talking to Benjamin Noyes on Friday, and then Karen Ula probably sometime this coming weekend. In any event, stay safe and come on back next time.